let us discuss how to interact with RESTful APIs using JavaScript and React. We will do this with the help of an example. So let us look at the UI wireframe of the example that we are going to implement. This is the example that we are going to implement. In the middle, we have a table which will show a list of book records. In the last column, we'll have delete links, and clicking on a particular delete link will delete the corresponding book record. At the top, we have some search functionality. User can type a search term over here and click on the search button, and that should update this table over here to show the search results. User should also be able to clear the search term. And in the bottom section, we have a couple of text fields and a button to add a new book. So we'll be implementing 4 pieces of functionality. The first is we'll list the books over here in the table. Next, we'll allow full text search of the books data. Third, we'll allow a new book record to be added. And the fourth piece of functionality is we'll allow delete operations as well. Before we start writing code in VS Code, we have to do a couple of things to get set up. Previously, when we did some HTTP request and response examples using Postman, we ran our JSON server using a file called books.json, and we ran it at this port 4000. So for our API, we'll again start JSON server at port 4000 using books.json, and we'll send our HTTP request using JavaScript and React code now. So first, let us start our JSON server using this command, json-server --watch books.json --port and 4000. Books.json is a JSON file, and it will have one JSON object. This is the opening curly brace, and this is the closing curly brace of that object. And it needs to have one key within double quotes like this, books, and the value of the key has to be an array. As you can see here, this is the opening square bracket, and this is the closing square bracket. And within the array, you can put any number of entries you want. I have 2 entries out here. Each entry is an object with keys ID, title, and author. We do not need reviews for this example. So if you are creating this file afresh, then you do not need to add reviews data. We'll only be operating with the books data. So once this command completes, JSON server will expose a RESTful API at localhost:4000/books. So we have our API up and running. Now let us create our React application and start its development server. If you want to create a new React application for this example, you can use this command npx create react app followed by app7, where app7 is the application's name. You can give any name you want. Once that is done, cd into that folder and then type npm start. Once you do that, the React development server will start and localhost:3000 will be opened in the new browser tab. So at this point, we'll have 2 servers running. One is our API server that we started using JSON server, and the second is our React applications development server. Our API server will be available at localhost:4000. Please note the port is 4000 for the API server, and our React development server will be running at localhost:3000. Please note that the port for our development server is 3000. Next, I have opened the React applications folder in VS Code, and under the src folder, I have created a component subfolder, and within the components folder, I have created a subfolder called API_examples, and I'll put my example component in this folder. So I'm going to add a new file called books from api.js. This will be a function component, so let's write function books from API, and it has to return some JSX, so let's write a return statement. We need to do one more thing to complete our setup before we start to write code. We need to install this package called Axios. Previously, we have used Postman to make our HTTP requests. Postman allowed us to make different kinds of HTTP requests like GET requests, POST requests, delete requests, etc. Axios will help us to make all those different kinds of HTTP requests in JavaScript. So let's install that. I'll stop my React development server once, and I'll type npm install Axios, and that will add Axios to our React application. Once that command completes, if you open package.json, you can see that under dependencies, there will be a new entry for Axios. So now we can use Axios to make HTTP requests in our JavaScript code. Before we start writing our code, let us examine the UI wireframe once again. Like I mentioned previously, there are 4 pieces of functionality that we have to implement. The first is we have to display the books in a table like this over here. Next, we have to implement some search functionality. Then we have to add the ability to add a new book record. And finally, we should allow deleting of book records. Let us first implement displaying of book records in a table. Let me quickly point out a common strategy that developers use when they have to build a React component that gets its data from an API. Very often we start off with hard-coded data, and we write our JSX using the hard-coded data And once our UI is looking good using the hard-coded data, we then write code to interact with the API and to get the actual data. So let's try that. I'm going to type const books equals, and I'll go to books.json and I'll copy the value of books. That means I'll copy this array over here and I'll paste it over here. So what we have done here is we have hard-coded the data for the books variable for now. However, let us make one minor modification. We know that books will eventually be a state variable because the book records that are displayed in this table will change depending on whether the user decides to delete some book records or add book records or search for book records. So depending on what the user does, the book records that are displayed in the table over here will change. So the list of book records needs to be a state variable. So what we can do here is we can make books a state variable and name our setter method as setBooks, and then let us pass this array as the initial value to our useState function call. So let's write useState and let's pass this as a parameter so that this array will be the initial value of the books state variable. So we have managed to put in some test data for our books state variable. Now let's start writing some JSX. So I'll add an empty root tag and also close the empty root tag. I'll add a comment which says books table, and below that let us place a div, and within the div let us put our table tag. Let us first add our headers, which are ID, title and author. So I'm going to type thead, and within thead let us add tr, and the th values will be ID, title and author. So I'm going to type ID, title and author. Let's add this fourth column later on. We'll implement delete at the end. So let's add that when we implement delete. And in our t body, we need to create rows for each of these book records. So we need to take the books variable and we need to create table rows for each of the book records like this. So that will be an expression that needs to be evaluated. So let's add the curly braces. So let's write books.map, and map takes in a function. Let's pass an arrow function. So I'm going to pass book as the parameter, and for the function body I'm going to specify the return expression using the brackets, and I'm going to create a tr tag to represent each row, and each row will have 3 columns corresponding to ID, title and author. So I'm going to type td, and we have to embed the expression book.id for ID. Let me duplicate the line, and in this column let's embed book.title for the title field, and in third column let's embed book.author for the author field. So we have written some JSX. Let's export this component now and let's check how it looks. So I'm going to type export default books from API. Before we forget, let's import useState from React, otherwise we'll get an error. So I'm going to type import useState from React, and now let us go to app.js and clear out the content within the root div here. So I have done that, and let's specify books from API component over here. VS Code has automatically added the import statement for me. So now let us go to the web page and look at the output. Make sure the development server is running. If it's not running, type npm start to start the development server. And as you can see here, our table has been rendered and it is showing 2 rows. And the data for this table is coming from this array over here, which we specified as the initial value of the books state variable. Let's quickly add some CSS to make this look a little better. So I'm going to select my API_examples folder, and I'm going to add a new file called books from API.css. Note the CSS file extension at the end. And to this file, let me add some CSS like this. What the CSS will do is this will make our table look a little bit better. This will add borders, but those borders will be collapsed because of this CSS rule over here. This will help us to center our table, and this margin and padding will add a little bit of space. To use the CSS rules, we have to import the file. So let's write import, and we have to specify the relative path of the CSS file. The file is in the same folder, so we just have to specify / and books from API.css like this. So if we save the file now and go to our web page, we can see that our table is centered and things are looking a little bit nicer. So our table is now looking like the table in the UI wireframe. Now let us add code to get this data from our API, which is running on localhost /4000. And for that we'll use the useEffect React hook and Axios. So let's import them. So I'm going to add use effect over here, and I'm also going to add an import statement to import Axios. So I'm going to write import Axios from Axios. Let's clear these two entries now so that the initial value that we are passing to useState becomes an empty array. And below this line, I'm going to create a function called getBooksData and updateState. Let's make that an arrow function, and in its function body, let's write a comment use Axios getBooksData. We can write code using Axios in a couple of ways. One way is to pass in an object to represent the config values. The object should have the HTTP method and the URL of the API endpoint and any possible message data. So let's do that. So let's write Axios and let's pass in an object. We have to specify the method, which is get in our case, because in order to retrieve all books, we need to use the get operation against the URL /books. So we need to specify the HTTP method as get and the URL as /books. So let's do that. So we have specified the HTTP method as get, and let's specify the URL as http localhost :4000/books. So this statement over here will create a get HTTP request against the URL localhost :4000/books. Let us assign the HTTP response of this statement to a variable called response. So I'm going to type const response equals. So now the HTTP response from the HTTP request that Axios creates will be assigned to the variable called response. We expect this response data to be books JSON data. So once we get back our HTTP response, we have to take the books data within this response and update the book state variable. And to update the book state variable, we have to use the setBooks method. So let's do that. So I'm going to type setBooks, and I'm going to pass response.data as the parameter to setBooks. Let me add a comment over here, update book state variable. Although this code looks correct, we have a problem here. The problem is that this Axios call over here is an asynchronous operation. That means this code, if we leave it as it is, will result in this line number 15. That means the setBooks call being executed before the Axios call finishes. But we want to update our state variable books only after the Axios call completes. And there is a simple solution for that. We just have to use the keyword await before the Axios function call. So what we have done here is we have just specified this keyword await before this Axios function call. And this simple change will ensure that this line of code will be executed only after this line of code completes. However, whenever we use the await keyword, we have to mark the function as an async function. So please remember that whenever we use the await keyword, we also have to use the async keyword as well. We can use the async keyword with traditional function definitions as well. So if this was a traditional function definition, we could have written async function followed by the function name like this. So we could have written this function like this. I'll switch back to the arrow function definition now. So now our function to retrieve all books data from the API is ready. And to start with, we want this function to run when the component gets loaded onto the page. And we have discussed previously that we can use the useEffect React hook for that purpose. So let's write useEffect, and useEffect takes in a callback. By the way, a callback is a function that is passed as a parameter to another function. So useEffect takes a callback as the first parameter. I'm going to specify a arrow function as the callback, and in the function body of the callback, I'm going to call this function getBooksData and updateState over here. However, for our current requirement, which is to get data from the API and display it in a table, for this requirement, we just need to invoke this function only when the component loads. And if we want an effect to run when the component loads, we have to specify a second parameter as an empty array. When we specify the second parameter as an empty array, the callback, which is the first parameter, gets invoked only when the component is loaded onto the page. So let's look at the output now and see if we are getting our data from our API. As you can see from the output, it seems to be working. Let's go to the network tab and look at the HTTP response. Let's reload the page and let's examine the HTTP request and response here. Let me increase this size a little bit more. You can see that a GET request has been made to this URL http localhost :4000/books. And let's look at the response. So I'm going to click on response now. And as you can see here, there are 2 book records in this array. And what we have done is we have taken that array and updated the books state variable using the setBooks function call. So if you go to components and if we select the books from API component, we can see that under hooks we have a state variable which is an array over here. If we expand the array, we can see that there are 2 entries over here, and this is the data that is being shown over here. So we are done with our first piece of functionality, which is to retrieve all of the book records and show them in a table.